It was a busy spot, a large town, and on the river there was a small harbor, where vessels were anchored, which had probably arrived from the sea. Papers were published there too, and I met with journalists and gave them an account of my travels. And before very long, I actually read in the papers about the strange man who had arrived in the town from Krasnoyarsk. I also asked the journalists, to whom I had given an account of my travels, to help me get the provisions cheaply, as they were quite expensive. For that reason, too, I was unwilling to spend the winter in the town itself. The innkeeper asked too much for his accommodation. For the amount which I offered him, he would have let me sleep in a stable among the other people's horses, and this was not to my liking. Nor would he allow me to make a fire in the stable, so I decided I would rather put together a hut somewhere outside the town and live there until spring came. So I bought provisions to last me all the winter and proceeded for about 6 miles beyond the town in a northerly direction. There, all along the banks, were scattered many fishermen's cottages, and the native fishermen could be seen on all sides. I discovered that there were many empty huts, and I found one all by myself, where I knew that I should not be bothered by the natives, and I spent the rest of the winter in it comfortably. During that winter, I saw the polar lights for the first time in their full strength. I was vastly astonished at this strange freak of nature, but I was not afraid of it, knowing that this was the kind of thing which would help to form the sum total of my experiences, and that all the things which I now regarded as an absolute miracle, I should later on consider as ordinary as sunset and sunrise had been hitherto. I part with my horse by the Arctic Ocean. In the middle of March, I took a trip into the town, laid in a good stock of supplies, and inquired for full particulars about the rest of my journey. I was told that between the shore and the mountains I could comfortably reach the settlement of Chimtse, and from there it would not be a long distance to the island of Kolyuchin, a place of call for large whalers proceeding to the Arctic Ocean. Perhaps one of the captains would take me on there, but everyone told me that I should, first of all, buy some reindeer, because I should not be able to make any headway from Chimtse with a horse, as there would be no more pasture for him there, while the reindeer had plenty of pasture on the tundras, where they fed on lichens. The journey to Chimtse passed off without any difficulties, quickly and without any noteworthy happenings. On the way I met with Baramis, who were going to the market at Lower Kolimsk. Snow was still lying on the plains and the rocks, which stretched on my right toward the south. The farther I went, the closer I got to the shore, so that one day I suddenly saw in front of me a vast white surface, the ice floes, the edges of which glistened in the sun like sparks. Before me lay the Arctic Ocean, the goal of my aspirations, the place that I had decided to begin a new life and seek my fortune. I must confess that I had formed a slightly different idea of it. I had not imagined it would be so wild and rugged. In places, the stretch of ice was flat, but elsewhere it rose up in long layers, full of irregular notches and clefts. But I again left the shore because I wanted to get on to the most convenient road. From day to day, I saw more clearly that in those regions where vegetation gradually dwindles away, I really should have to part with my horse. The thought of this parting wrung my heart. When I reached Chimtse in the middle of April, I first of all inquired where I could get a reindeer or dogs cheaply. There was a man, a former Tsarist official, whom I met with there, and he advised me to go to a certain Baramist who got his living by breeding reindeer and selling them very cheaply. He himself took me to him. So from this man I bought 4 reindeer, fine, full-grown males, and a sledge, while he bought from me my horse and cart. In addition, I paid him 4 Tsarist rubles. I shed tears when I parted with my horse, for he had shared with me so many years of hardship, and he had always been a good friend to me, and sometimes the only one I had. But I did not want to lose time. I had to move forward rapidly. I also bought a tent, a fur suit, and everything that was necessary for life in that clime. I returned once more to the Baramist and said goodbye to my horse, and as I drove off slowly with my new team, I looked around, and there stood the horse. I saw him watching me. I kept turning around and waving goodbye to him until he disappeared from sight. Many a time after all those years, I have wondered what the Baramist did with my horse, whether he slaughtered him or whether he was still able to use him for pulling a cart. But I never went back to that place. Before I left, the reindeer merchant pointed out to me that on the journey I must be particularly careful to reach a spot at least once a day where I could graze the reindeer. As soon as a reindeer has had no food for a day, or at the outside of a day and a half, he will refuse to go any further. He will lie down and will not budge. I was told that there had been cases when the unfortunate owner of a reindeer team had finally been obliged to harness himself to the sledge and pull it if he wanted to reach human habitation or the tundra. Many people, it seemed, had hardly already perished that way because they had not reached the tundra in time. I was told that it was no use picking a supply of lichens because the reindeer will not eat food which has been touched by human hands. Having obtained this information, I set out full of alarm eastward in the direction of the island of Kolyuchin. Good heavens, to this very day I remember how thunderstruck I was when the reindeer set off at a trot. I sat on the sledge like a lord, and away we flew like the wind across the snow-covered plains. By this means I made progress at least 5 times as fast as with my poor Pawnee. But I must again admit that I never, during my wanderings across Siberia, did I experience such terror, not even when I was awakened by the horse in the middle of a dense forest surrounded by a circle of green lights, the eyes of wolves, as now during the days when we were galloping along at a full speed, and when sometimes at evening I saw no signs of any tundra round about, often only rocks and snow and ice, and many a time I felt that my last hour was near. Nevertheless, here too I was in luck's way, and in the end I always managed to find the tundra. I noticed how strangely the reindeer used to graze. Sometimes they would feed on lichens with every sign of enjoyment, and suddenly they would stop, turn from the lichens, and search a little farther on, where they again began to feed. It puzzled my brain to know why they would eat in one place and not another, because after all, the lichens were the same everywhere. Sometimes I knelt down and rummaged about among the lichens, examining them closely to see whether they differed from the lichens a few yards away, but I could detect nothing. To my mind, they were all alike. So my reindeer remained a puzzle to me. But I soon grew very fond of them when I saw how useful they were. The natives of the north, that is to say, those who have heard about Christianity and the sign of the cross, regard the reindeer as a holy animal, because in its foot there is a bone which resembles this sign. Of course, it never occurred to me to value them on account of this bone. I was simply grateful to them for carrying me so safely to my destination. I reached Kolyuchin within a week, but the ocean had long been frozen over, so I saw that there was nothing really for me to do there, as it was at that season there was no chance that any whalers would arrive. Fortunately, not far from Kolyuchin, on the mainland, I came across a small expedition of people who, as they told me, were on their way to the gold-bearing river Anadyr. They gave me an exact description of the road to the south and did not leave me empty-handed. I was always overjoyed when I came across people who showed signs of trust in me. It was almost a miracle because by that time I scarcely looked like a human being after all those years that I'd been wandering through Siberia. With long hair and beard, hardened by exposure to wind and weather, I looked more like a savage, if not like some species of monkey. The first Eskimos. So now I was galloping along southwards. The people whom I met with here and there told me what the land and the islands around the Bering Sea were like, and I decided that I would get around these regions before the ocean was free of ice. First of all, I wanted to visit St. Lawrence Island, which, as I had heard, was inhabited by Eskimos, whom I had never yet seen. Then Vladimir Island, which is situated near it. Finally, I was attracted by the river Anadyr. I drove across the most easterly point of Asia without any mishap, because from the description I was well acquainted with the road where there was plenty of tundra. So before long I stood on the shores of the frozen Bering Sea and set off in the ice for St. Lawrence Island. While traveling on the ice, I discovered that the rapid galloping of the reindeer had certain drawbacks. They dashed across the ice like mad until the sledge bumped up and down on the irregular surface. But sometimes they got onto the ice, which rose up suddenly and descended again on the other side by a steep slope. As soon as the reindeer had reached such a spot in their onward rush, they could not stop on the edge of the barrier of ice with its sudden drop, and so they dashed on, causing the sledge with me in it to fly along in the air for several yards. When I was then bumped to the ground, it very nearly shook the life out of me.